The super empath effect. The real reason avoidants always return. Have you ever noticed how the person who ran from you somehow finds their way back the moment you finally start healing? It's not an accident. It's the super empath effect, and it's the one thing avoidants can't outrun, even when they think they can. Most of us go through life believing that the people who push us away do it because we weren't enough, weren't exciting enough, weren't lovable enough, weren't the one, but that's not the truth. The truth is this. Avoidants don't run from you. They run from the feelings you awaken in them. A super empath, someone who leads with emotional depth, compassion, intuition, and genuine connection, doesn't just enter someone's life, they shift the atmosphere. They amplify emotional truth. They make intimacy feel possible. And for someone who is avoidantly attached, that's both irresistible and terrifying. Avoidants push away what they most desire because desire makes them vulnerable, and vulnerable feels dangerous. But here's the twist. The very thing they flee from becomes the very thing they come searching for again. Because after you've loved an avoidant in the way only a super empath can, fully, warmly, without judgment, they go back out into the world and realize something painful. Most connections feel flat in comparison. They meet people who match their distance but not their depth. They meet people who agree with their emotional walls but not their potential. They meet people who are easy but not safe. And then they remember you. They remember the way your presence made them feel seen without being exposed, challenged without being attacked, wanted without being trapped. What they didn't have the courage to receive the first time becomes the thing they crave after you've gone. And that is the super empath effect. But here's the part most people miss. Avoidants don't return because you waited. They return because you stopped waiting. They don't come back because you proved your loyalty. They come back because you reclaimed your power. See, something shifts in you. You stop overgiving. You stop explaining your worth. You stop chasing. You start valuing yourself in a way they always sensed you were capable of, but never thought you'd actually embrace. And suddenly the very dynamic that allowed them to keep distance is gone. You're no longer the person standing at the emotional door. You're the person walking toward your own future. And that is when avoidants realized something life-changing. They didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because they weren't ready. And now they're not just missing you. They're missing the version of themselves they believe only you could activate. That's why they circle back, not for possession, not for ego, but for the feeling of possibility you awakened in them, the one they didn't know how to stand in before. And listen carefully, their return is not a sign you should take them back. It's a sign that you've grown beyond needing them to. The super empath effect isn't about winning someone. It's about becoming someone who doesn't shrink to be loved, someone who doesn't overgive to be chosen, someone who brings out truth in others without losing truth in themselves. Let them return if they must. Let them explain. Let them apologize. But you keep becoming the person who learned that the ones who run may come back, but the ones who rise don't wait. Avoidants don't run from people. They run from vulnerability. That idea alone can feel confusing until you understand what vulnerability actually represents to someone with an avoidant attachment style. To a securely attached person or a naturally empathetic person, vulnerability is connection. It's intimacy. It's safety. It's the space where you can breathe easily and share yourself without fear. But for an avoidant, vulnerability often carries a completely different meaning. It signals exposure, risk, and the possibility of losing control. Emotional closeness is experienced not as comfort, but as pressure. Pressure to perform emotionally, to reciprocate feelings they've never felt safe expressing, to step into a version of intimacy they have not yet learned how to inhabit. When an avoidant meets a super empath, the very dynamic that terrifies them is the first thing that awakens them. A super empath sees beneath surface behavior almost instantly. They can feel emotional shifts that others miss. They respond to walls not with panic or anger, but with curiosity and warmth. They bring patience, understanding, and presence, qualities that many avoidantly attached individuals never learned how to receive. Instead of being dismissed or punished for emotional distance, they are met with compassion. Instead of being criticized for withdrawing, they are met with gentle awareness. This is disarming in a way they don't know how to process. They don't experience it as comfort, they experience it as exposure. Deep down, avoidants are not cold. They're overwhelmed. They crave connection just like anyone else, but they fear the responsibility and emotional visibility that comes with it. When someone genuinely sees them, they feel the weight of being known, and to someone with an avoidant pattern, being known of. 10 feels indistinguishable from being judged or trapped. Even if the super empath is not judging them, the avoidant's internal narrative will interpret closeness as expectation and expectation as danger. Their instincts tell them to retreat before they disappoint someone or lose themselves in the relationship. Imagine an avoidant's emotional world as a room they keep locked. They've decorated it sparsely, kept the lights dim, and convinced themselves it's safer that way. A super empath walks in and effortlessly opens the curtains. They don't pry or demand. Their presence alone brings in more light. To the avoidant, that light is both comforting and frightening. They want the clarity but fear what the clarity will reveal. They want the warmth but fear what it will require of them. So they do what they've practiced their whole lives. They close the door again, even though part of them wants to keep it open. It's important to understand that avoidants don't leave because of a lack of feelings. They often leave because the feelings are too strong. They sense the emotional gravity the super empath brings, and though it draws them in, it also threatens their coping mechanisms. Many avoidants spent years teaching themselves that they don't need others, that independence is safety, that self-reliance protects them from the chaos of emotional unpredictability. When someone arrives who effortlessly bypasses their emotional defenses, it challenges their entire identity. It's not just the relationship that's overwhelming, it's the unraveling of everything they've believed about connection. That's why avoidants will often retreat at the exact moment the relationship becomes more meaningful. It's not a rejection of the person. They are retreating from the internal alarm system that goes off when closeness feels real. The fear is primal. The fear of inadequacy, of emotional failure, of being engulfed, of losing autonomy, and in their panic, they make decisions that seem contradictory to what they feel. They may miss the person while simultaneously convincing themselves that distance is necessary. They may care deeply, but behave like someone indifferent. They may long for connection, yet choose isolation. To someone who gives love freely, this push-pull pattern seems baffling, even hurtful. But internally, the avoidant believes they are protecting themselves and possibly even protecting the other person from their perceived inability to be enough. What complicates the dynamic even further is that avoidants often do recognize the empathy and emotional safety the super empath offers. They just don't know how to stay present in it. They don't yet trust that closeness doesn't mean losing themselves. They've spent so much of their lives maintaining emotional distance that when they feel drawn to someone who feels genuinely safe, they mistake that pull for danger. A super empath activates emotional hunger in them that they don't want to admit exists. They awaken longing, intimacy, vulnerability, things that the avoidant has suppressed for years. It's like turning on a faucet in a house where the water hasn't run in decades. The plumbing shakes, the pipes groan, the water sputters out unevenly. It's messy. That messiness convinces the avoidant that something is wrong, when in reality, something is finally trying to heal. But instead of leaning into the discomfort, they slip back into old survival patterns, distancing, shutting down, running. They don't run because they don't care. They run because caring exposes them. A super empath creates a type of emoji, onal safety that avoidants can't find anywhere else. And that's precisely what makes the connection unforgettable for them. It's not that the super empath tries harder or cares more. It's that they intuitively understand emotions in a way that makes other people feel seen without being pressured. They have an ability to listen with presence, respond with sincerity, and connect with depth. To most people, that feels comforting. To an avoidant, it feels like an emotional experience they didn't realize they were starving for until it was right in front of them. It awakens a hunger they rarely acknowledge in themselves. Most avoidantly attached individuals move through relationships on the surface. They know how to participate in charm, chemistry, and fun, but intimate emotional landscapes often feel foreign. They stick to safe distances, controlled interactions, and predictable emotional patterns. They've learned to keep their internal world locked behind tightly guarded doors. But when a super empath steps into their life, that emotional world begins to shift almost immediately. The super empath doesn't force vulnerability. They create an environment where vulnerability feels possible. They're patient where others get frustrated. They're attentive in a way that feels gentle, not intrusive. They create soft spaces in the relationship where emotional expression becomes less of a threat and more of an invitation. This is the paradox for the avoidant. They don't feel judged. They don't feel demanded. They don't feel pushed. And that absence of pressure becomes the first safe opening they've ever experienced. For the first time, they can reveal pieces of themselves without panic. They can share fears without shame. They can admit confusion without being punished. The super EMP. Ath's presence makes emotional truth feel survivable. Avoidants rarely encounter this specific brand of connection. Many partners either take their distance personally or try to chase them into closeness. But the super empath does neither. They have a natural way of holding emotional space without suffocating the other person. They don't shrink from intimacy, and they also don't weaponize it. They simply model authenticity, and that modeling encourages the avoidant to explore their own emotional depth, even if only in small steps. This slow, gentle unraveling is something they begin to crave because it feels like a relief. It feels like being met without being overwhelmed. The emotional safety a super empath creates also shows up in the way they communicate. Their tone, timing, and emotional intelligence allow them to express needs without accusation. They don't escalate tension, they diffuse it. They don't speak to win, they speak to understand. For an avoidant who expects conflict or emotional overload, this is transformative. It rewires their expectations of closeness. They begin to associate connection not with danger, but with steadiness. And once that link is created, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to detach emotionally, even if they physically distance themselves. Another powerful element is the empath's ability to validate feelings without amplifying insecurity. Avoidants fear emotional chaos because they often grew up in environments where feelings were unpredictable, criticized, or ignored. A super empath senses the emotional undercurrent beneath the avoidant's behavior and responds to the root, not the reaction. When the avoidant gets distant, the empath doesn't spiral. They stay grounded. When the avoidant becomes overwhelmed, the empath doesn't poo. Shh. They soften. This consistent emotional stability becomes a reference point the avoidant didn't even know they needed. It feels like the emotional home they never had. But the safety the super empath creates isn't just about gentleness. It's also about emotional truth. Empaths don't shy away from real conversations. They can name what they feel and ask for what they need without turning it into a battlefield. This honesty, delivered with empathy, teaches the avoidant that intimacy doesn't require losing oneself. It doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require constant emotional performance. It simply requires presence. And presence is something the avoidant learns to trust through repeated experience with the empath. All of this forms an imprint, a unique emotional signature. When the avoidant leaves, they don't just leave a relationship, they leave the only space where they ever felt both safe and seen. Other relationships don't replicate this. They may find excitement, companionship, attraction, or compatibility elsewhere, but the emotional safety they experience with the super empath becomes a benchmark. They subconsciously compare every connection to. With most people, their distance is either mirrored or resented. But with a super empath, it was understood. And understanding is something avoidants don't receive often. They walk away thinking they can recreate the emotional ease somewhere else, but they quickly discover that what they had wasn't typical at all. It was rare. It was grounding. It was healing in ways they weren't ready to appreciate. This is why avoidants almost always return. Not because the relationship was perfect, not because they suddenly became ready, but because the emotional safety they felt is something they can't duplicate. They remember how they were treated, not judged, how they were understood, not criticized, how they were met with depth, not demands, and in a world where emotional distance is their default. The memory of being welcomed, not chased, not cornered, but welcomed, becomes powerful enough to draw them back. Avoidants tend to return after realizing that other connections lack the depth and warmth they experienced with a super empath. At first, when they pull away, they convince themselves they are pursuing freedom, clarity, or emotional relief. They genuinely believe distance will help them recalibrate. For many avoidants, leaving or withdrawing feels like regaining control over their internal world. They expect that once they step back, the discomfort they felt in the relationship, the vulnerability, the closeness, the expectations will disappear. But what they don't anticipate is the emotional void that takes its place. The space they thought would feel liberating often ends up feeling strangely empty. Initially, they interpret that emptiness as peace, but over time, the absence of connection reveals a deeper absence they never learned to acknowledge. They may not consciously label it as loneliness. Avoidants often struggle to recognize or articulate feelings that sit beneath the surface. But they start to notice a subtle shift. Their world becomes quieter in a way that doesn't soothe them. The excitement they expected to feel doesn't arrive. The sense of relief they anticipated fades quickly. What they are left with is neutrality. No chaos, but no warmth either. When avoidants go back into dating or attempt new relationships, they almost always gravitate toward people who match their comfort zone. Individuals who maintain emotional distance, avoid deep conversations, or lack the intuitive understanding that empaths naturally offer. At first, this feels safe. There are no demands, no invitations into vulnerability, no emotional pressure. But, over time, the avoidant notices that something is missing. Conversations feel flat, surface level, or transactional. Interactions lack emotional resonance. The connection feels more like an arrangement than a relationship. It's predictable but uninspiring. With a super empath, they felt alive in a way they didn't fully understand at the time. They were challenged, yes, but also emotionally activated. An empath's way of listening and responding brought out aspects of the avoidant they rarely access. Tenderness, longing, curiosity, softness, these parts of themselves started to emerge before they panicked and retreated. Now, away from that dynamic, those parts retreat back into hiding, but the memory of accessing them lingers. Avoidants don't forget how someone made them feel, even if they weren't ready to stay in that feeling. Other connections rarely ignite those same emotional layers. The avoidant finds themselves going through the motions, maintaining distance out of habit rather than necessity. They realize that relationships lacking depth may feel easier, but they also feel emptier. They don't feel inspired to open up. They don't feel drawn inward. They don't feel the emotional reflections that the empath naturally provided. Without recognizing it consciously, they begin to compare every new interaction with the emotional imprint left by the super empath. It's not a comparison they articulate. It's something they feel. They might meet someone attractive or compatible, but still notice a lack of emotional atmosphere. Something is missing in the silence between conversations. Something is missing in the way the other person responds during difficult moments. Something is missing in the way connection feels or doesn't feel. That something is the empath's unique blend of warmth, emotional intelligence, and intuitive presence. Avoidants often believed at the time that the intensity of the connection with a super empath was uncomfortable. But in the absence of it, they begin to realize that depth wasn't the problem. It was their own readiness. The empath's depth made them feel something real, something too real for the emotional safeguards they had built. When the empath is gone, the avoidant discovers that shallow connections do not provide the relief they once thought they wanted. They simply provide distance, and distance isn't the same as peace. Another crucial factor is that avoidants tend to replay emotional moments in their minds once they've had time and space away from them. While they may have reacted defensively or withdrawn in the moment, later they often revisit those memories with more clarity. They remember how the empath handled conflict with grace instead of escalation. They remember how they were listened to rather than dismissed. They remember the gentleness during vulnerable moments, the emotional patience, the sense of being understood without having to explain everything. This emotional replay makes new relationships feel emotionally lacking by comparison. There's also a subtle but powerful dynamic at play. A super empath doesn't chase. They may hurt, they may grieve, but they don't cling. They eventually redirect their emotional energy back toward themselves. This shift in the empath creates a new internal experience for the avoidant. The person who once felt like a source of overwhelm now becomes a source of longing. The safety they once fled becomes the safety they crave. The warmth they once took for granted becomes the warmth they suddenly can find elsewhere. Avoidants return not because they want to repeat the past, but because they cannot replicate the emotional quality the super empath offered. Most connections stay on the surface. Most people don't see through their defenses. Most relationships do not invite them into a deeper version of themselves. Without that depth, the avoidant eventually feels emotionally underfed in ways they cannot verbalize. They may not understand the psychology, but they understand the feeling. Nowhere else feels quite like home. That realization pulls them back, not out of convenience, but because something inside them recognizes that what they left behind was rare. Avoidants return when you stop chasing and reclaim your self-worth because something fundamental shifts in the energy of the connection. In the beginning, the avoidant is often drawn to the warmth, depth, and emotional generosity of the super empath. They feel magnetized by the ease of being understood and the comfort of being accepted. But as intimacy deepens, their old defenses rise up. They retreat not because they don't care, but because caring makes them feel out of control. When this happens, the empath often responds with understanding, reassurance, or a desire to repair. They lean in, trying to bridge the emotional gap. But to an avoidant, that closeness, no matter how gentle, can feel like pressure, so they recoil even further. In these early stages, the avoidant becomes accustomed to a relational pattern. They pull back, the empath reaches forward. They withdraw, the empath stabilizes the connection. They create distance, the empath tries to close it with compassion or clarity. This dynamic unintentionally reinforces the avoidant's belief that they can regulate the closeness in the relationship without fully participating in it. It teaches them that their avoidance will be met with patience and that their emotional hesitancy will be compensated for by the empath's emotional effort. But the moment the empath begins reclaiming their self-worth, the entire dynamic changes. This shift doesn't always look dramatic on the outside. Often, it begins quietly. The empath stops explaining themselves to someone who isn't listening. They stop overthinking the avoidant silence. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop carrying a relationship on their back. It's not withdrawal, it's recalibration. They start to redirect their emotional energy away from the avoidant and back into their own life. Friends, passions, goals, routines, new experiences. Even their inner voice becomes kinder and more grounded. They shift from how can I make this work to how do I want to feel in a relationship. And that shift, subtle, steady, powerful, is something the avoidant feels even from a distance. Avoidants are highly sensitive to changes in relational pressure. When the empath stops chasing, the avoidant no longer feels the invisible emotional pull that once made them tense. The absence of pressure feels calming at first, but soon it begins to feel like something else, loss. The pattern they were used to, the reassurance that the empath's love was always available, begins to fade. The avoidant starts to sense the difference even before they intellectually understand it. The texts become less frequent, the emotional check-ins disappear, the soothing presence becomes distant. What once felt like an overwhelming closeness now feels like an unexpected absence. And avoidants don't handle emotional absence as well as they pretend. The avoidance return is often triggered not by the empath's presence, but by their absence. When the empath stops reaching out, they disrupt the avoidance expectation of emotional availability. Avoidants rarely realize how much they relied on the empath's stability until it's gone. The very person they once believed they needed distance from becomes the person they suddenly feel drawn back toward. This isn't because the empath has played a game or used a strategy. Authentic self-worth isn't manipulation. It's an energetic shift. The empath is no longer chasing, fixing, or proving. They've stepped into a version of themselves that doesn't revolve around another person's emotional capacity. And when the empath stops orbiting the avoidant loses the safe emotional shadow they used to stand in. The dynamic inverts. The avoidant begins to wonder where the warmth went, why the connection feels different, and whether they misunderstood the depth of what they had. The confidence they once felt in the empath's constant affection begins to crack. They start to question their assumptions. Did the empath move on? Did they stop caring? Was the connection less secure than they thought? These questions create the emotional discomfort the avoidant spent so long avoiding, but instead of pulling them away, the discomfort pulls them closer. This is where the avoidant's internal landscape shifts. Without the empath chasing, the avoidant is left alone with their genuine feelings, unbuffered, unsoothed, and unavoidable. They begin to realize that the distance they created did not bring the peace they expected. They begin to long for the very connection they spent so much energy resisting. And most importantly, they start to understand that the empath's value did not disappear. It simply stopped being freely given. When you reclaim your self-worth, you stop negotiating for a place in someone's emotional world. You stop shrinking to maintain harmony. You stop loving in ways that diminish you. And this transformation is the exact trigger that awakens the avoidant's awareness of what they lost. Not because you withheld love, but because you stopped abandoning yourself to give it. Avoidants return when the empath rises, not to reclaim the past, but because your growth makes them see what they were too afraid to hold on to the first time. Their return is not a cue to reopen the door, but a reflection of your growth, because once you've stepped into your self-worth, the meaning of their reappearance changes entirely. In the early stages, their absence might have felt like the end of something precious, and their return may have once represented hope, validation, or closure. But as you heal, the emotional landscape transforms. What you needed from them before, you no longer need now. The avoidance re-entry into your life becomes less about rekindling a relationship and more about recognizing how far you've come from the person who once waited, overgave, or believed love had to be earned. The moment an avoidant returns, they often expect to find the same version of you, the one who loved them with a wide open heart, who saw their potential beneath their fear, who tried to meet them where they were, even when they wouldn't move toward you. But when a super empath has done their inner work, that earlier version has shifted. Your emotional boundaries are firmer, your expectations are clearer, your sense of self is stronger. You don't crave their validation the way you once did because your healing filled the gaps you tried to use them to soothe. And when they return, the contrast is undeniable. An avoidance return is typically motivated by emotional clarity they didn't have before. They revisit memories with new awareness. They recognize the unique emotional presence you offered. They understand, sometimes for the first time, the depth and patience and warmth you brought into their life. But their return doesn't automatically signal readiness, growth, or the capacity for a different type of connection. It simply signals recognition. A recognition that what they had with you was rare. But you now understand that rarity is not a reason to reopen a chapter that caused you to shrink or abandon your own needs. Your growth allows you to see their return through a new lens. Instead of interpreting it as proof that you were always the one, you see it as a reflection of the emotional imprint you left. You realize that people often come back to the place where they felt the safest, even if they weren't capable of fully appreciating it. You recognize that their return says more about the impact of your presence than it does about their readiness to give you what you deserved. This shift in perception prevents you from slipping into old patterns. It reminds you that longing isn't love and returning isn't change. As you step into your self-worth, you become more attuned to your needs. Stability, reciprocity, emotional presence, communication. You begin to understand that the kind of love you want cannot exist in a dynamic where one person fears connection and the other overfunctions to maintain it. And with this clarity, their return becomes a moment of empowerment rather than confusion. You no longer feel compelled to prove your value. You no longer feel tempted to shrink your needs to keep them close. Instead, you evaluate their presence with discernment rather than desperation. What once felt like a once-in-a-lifetime emotional bond now appears as a chapter that taught you to love yourself more deeply. You see how much energy you poured into trying to understand them, to soothe them, to meet them where they were emotionally stuck. And now, when they return, you recognize the importance of meeting yourself where you are. Your self-growth gives you the strength to hold the door closed, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. It's not rejection, it's alignment. When you grow, the emotional gravity of the connection changes direction. Instead of being pulled back into old dynamics, you stand firmly in your present. The avoidant may try to step closer, drawn by the stability and warmth they once took for. Granted, but you are no longer a sanctuary for someone who can't meet you. Your sanctuary is now within yourself. And from that place of strength, you can see clearly that someone returning is not the same as someone choosing you consistently. Your growth teaches you that love is not measured by someone's return, but by their ability to show up, stay present, and build something real. It teaches you that emotional chemistry is not enough without emotional commitment. It teaches you that you don't have to explain your needs or defend your boundaries. They are valid simply because they exist. And perhaps the most powerful realization your growth brings is this: the closure you once hoped would come from them ultimately came from within you. Their return becomes a quiet confirmation. Not that they're meant to be yours, but that you were right to let go. It reflects the undeniable truth that you evolved. You rose. You reclaimed your power. You learned to love yourself in ways that no longer leave room for a connection built on inconsistency or fear. They come back because they finally see your value. You don't open the door because you finally see your own. When we talk about the super empath effect, we're not talking about winning someone back, chasing someone down, or proving your worth to the person who once ran from you. The real story is your evolution. The avoidance return is not the climax of your journey. It's the mirror that shows you how much you've grown. You no longer define yourself by who chooses you or who fears losing you. You define yourself by the standards you hold, the boundaries you honor, and the love you give to yourself first. They may return because they finally recognized your value, but you rise because you finally recognized your own. And that is true transformation. So whether someone comes back or stays gone, whether you reconnect or continue forward alone, let the lesson be this: you are never waiting on anyone's readiness. You are becoming the person who no longer settles for anything less than the emotional truth, intimacy, and respect you deserve. The power was never in their return. It was in your rise. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling, and for showing up for your own growth. You made space for this message, and that says something profound about who you're becoming. Take this with you. You are not defined by the people who left. You are defined by the courage it took to keep becoming someone they can't forget, and someone you can finally love without abandoning yourself. Thank you. Take care of your heart, and I'll see you next time.